sex. The fact of the matter is, yes, there are people who will feel like they're the other gender. But does that mean that the best choice is to permanently mutilate and alter their bodies? I just am not seeing the evidence, and you don't have the evidence because there is none. You can't provide me with the longitudinal data I'm asking for because it doesn't exist, and that's the issue.
Hail, citizen. I want to bring your attention to this video by YouTuber Aydin Paladin called I'm Trans Now, Diagnosing Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria. Miss Paladin has assembled an impressive amount of data and studies, so I felt the need to address this video as I feel she missed a couple of key points. I will be linking to her video in the description. It is 90 minutes long, so I don't blame you for wanting to watch her video first and then come back here, because I know you're a strong independent thinker who doesn't need experts to tell them what to think. But just in case you don't want to do that, I'll summarize the main takeaways of Miss Paladin's video. Now, it is a 90-minute video, but don't let that discourage you. It is entirely easy to summarize it because, you see, if we divide Aydin Spellbreaker's video into two parts, one part Aydin reads off statistics that she doesn't engage with, and one part, Aydin attempts to draw conclusions and threads through those statistics, we'd have about 70 minutes of the former and only about 20 minutes of the latter. The crux of her conclusions appears to be thus, but again, you should watch her video before accepting my conclusions, because I don't want to seem like I'm intentionally misrepresenting anything. The first is Aydin DPS Cleric taking exception with the idea of what is described as rapid onset gender dysphoria. However, Aydin misunderstands this condition in basically every conceivable way. We'll get into that, but Aydin is throwing out this dense mess of numbers to imply that being a transgender person is communicable, and seems to think that because gender dysphoria on the whole has been on the rise over the past 30 years, that this is proof of the fact that this condition is made up in the broader sense. The second is that Aydin is proposing that medical experts in gender treatment are preying on vulnerable autistic community to fill out the ranks of the transgenders, which dovetails with the broader argument that minors, like people with autism, are more vulnerable to social pressure, and that the real science shows that most transgender identifying youth are just confused and gay. And third, that gender dysphoria is a mental disorder, and why can't all these medical professionals clearly see what she, in her basement, has finally discovered, so she's going to set them straight. Now, I want to be straightforward and credit where credit is due. Nowhere in Aydin Paladin's video did I notice her engaging in any of the more, shall we call them, forward-presenting transphobic behaviors. You know, I don't recall her misgendering any of the subjects in her video. She tries to use the medical terminology as best she can. You know, typically when you see these kinds of alt-right propaganda type informatives, they fall back on misgendering, on calling trans women traps, that sort of thing. And nothing in Miss Paladin's video presents this way, or at least not that I remember. It was a very long video, so I want to take her presentation on its own terms, that it's a good faith argument over a disagreement on data, even if she seems to be getting her sources from some of those more blatant fear-mongering corners of the internet. And I also don't want to imply that all of Aydin's concerns are invalid. I simply question much of her methodology and the specifics of her conclusions, as well as the broad brush that she paints with. There are a couple of points I agree on, generally speaking, and I'll get to that. But let's lay out the three major points that I can't really address as they come up one by one, because they permeate Aydin Barbarian's videos as fundamental building blocks of her understanding of the issues at hand. Trying to extract them from individual talking points would be impossible because they're baked in, as it were. The first and most egregious is that Aydin leans very heavily on this study, The Proposal for Rapid Onset Gender Dysphoria by Lisa Littman. You may have heard of this one because once the Breitbart types got their hands on it, there was an immediate counter backlash at Brown University, who then pulled the paper. which was a dumb idea, because the paper itself was methodologically sound. But here is where we diverge from Aydin, because she seems incapable of reading a study and interacting with it in a meaningful, interpretive way. Aydin puts a great deal of emphasis on this paper. It makes up practically the first 30 minutes of her video, and is referenced often following that. The first thing I would say is, Miss Paladin gives this study an undue amount of authority. As we can see, this study is a survey of parents of children with gender dysphoria. Now, I'm not saying that parents aren't an important primary source in situations like this, but the way Aydin uses these figures as hard proof of many of her claims, like they're objective truths, is a bit disingenuous at best and intentionally misleading at the worst. You know, I remember when I brought my first girlfriend home and my parents were confused. Where did this girl come from? Thinking they'd know her very well, when if pressed, they could have, maybe, named 3 of my friends whom I spoke to at school. But they didn't really know much about my social circle, and I certainly don't imagine it's common practice in many countries, save for the Netherlands. For children to describe in detail every erection they get in math class for the cute girl 2 desks up front, right? I also remember meeting a friend's mother for the first time, and she asked us about his computer desktop, which, at the time, was a picture of some girl from a fighting game. We did our best to explain to her about how fandoms work and how people like to keep their favorite characters on hand. But her response was, I swear this is true. But then why do some of them have cat ears? Again, I'm not saying that parents are a bad resource. When it comes to being divine experts on their children, however, particularly with new concepts that they might not understand very well, we need to take their words with much more salt and much less gospel. And this is written by Littman herself. Quote, another limitation of this study is that it included only parental perspective. Ideally, data would be obtained from both parent and child, and the absence of either perspective paints an incomplete account of events. Input from the youth would have also yielded additional information. Further research that includes data collection from both parent and child is required to fully understand this condition. Further compounding this is that the study specifically selected its participants from websites where parents who were already concerned that their child might be feeling pressured into proclaiming themselves gender dysphoric gathered. Quote, the websites that were used for recruitment are sites which specifically offer to support parents worried about their transgender identifying children, and the population viewing these websites may be different from populations viewing websites that promote a gender affirming perspective, and both populations may differ from a broader general population in their attitudes about transgender identified individuals. You know, there's a potentiality here for some confirmation bias, but it was the easiest way to acquire the data of an as yet unrecognized condition. Tied into that objection, this study is not a definitive conclusion on the existence of rapid onset gender dysphoria. Rather, this is a paper which hypothesizes such a condition might exist and lays out clinical comorbids that warrant further study to determine if these issues are present or an anomaly. You know, this is the first step, the first person raising a question and finding a means of subdividing a group and asking her peers to try and replicate her results. This is not a compilation of many different studies that agree with each other. So in principle, the way Aydin's video begins with what I assume was meant to be a comedy routine of diagnosing rapid onset gender dysphoria is itself a flawed premise because none of these concurrent factors are declared to be symptomatic. Again, quoting Littman, this is not a prevalent study and does not attempt to evaluate the degree to which this presentation of a socially mediated onset of gender dysphoria or the use of the drive to transition as a maladaptive coping mechanism is widespread in the population. There are also minor flaws in the paper's methodology, which Littman herself admits to, such as the fact that her sample size is almost 83% girls, and that it denotes transgender youth associating together as a problem factor, which could just be explained that that's what typically happens in LGBT culture. Other minor nitpicks that the study doesn't hand-wave away, but ultimately just serve to illustrate that this is not something that would pass the smell test to get into the DSM-6. It still needs more research. So as you can see, we have a fundamental problem with Aydin's video already. One of her key postulates is full of crap and doesn't say what she insists it does. And I know I'm spending a lot of time on this, but as I said, this is a study of the foundation of roughly 1/3 of the content of Aydin's video, and it lurks in the background of all her other points. This is Aydin's primary source. This is not a prevalent study. So while this study is sound in its methodology, there are some massive asterisks to take into consideration before we apply any kind of conclusion to the results. Littman's study was only meant to present the idea that, for some adolescents, they might be using gender dysphoria as a shield for other issues, and it's a case she makes very well and does need to be studied more. The second major problem with Aydin Druid's video is that she purposefully misidentifies elements of transition and medical treatment, or at least I would presume it is intentional, because she repeats a very basic mistruth about very basic ground floor level information if you were researching the plight of the transgender community.
Anyway, the point is that it's true that people who are trans and take hormones can still be fecund. After all, there is research that has indicated that teenagers who have been placed on puberty blockers often return to normal menstrual function or seminal fluid production after the cessation of these GnRH analogs. As noted here in Hembry et al. 2017's massive overview of research and guides for medical practitioners. But the fact is, you'd be kind of hard-pressed to find any scientist or any research out there that shows you the conjunction of hormone blockers plus subsequent hormone therapy.
Aydin has drawn a distinct line between hormone replacement therapy, or HRT, from hormonal blockers that prevents someone's natural hormones. So let's define a few things. HRT is the process of medically altering a person's body chemistry to suit their preferred gender. So for a transgender woman, that is someone male to female, medications are taken to suppress the innate testosterone in the body, and estrogen is supplied, usually in the form of pills or injections, to make the body hormonally sound. And in transgender men, the reverse is true, where testosterone is introduced in the body, and sometimes estrogen is blocked, though practically speaking, testosterone is so overpowering on the human body that many transgender men go without these blockers. Which happens because, speaking biologically, testosterone has to be overwhelming because every human fetus starts as a female. But whereas hormone blockers for the hormones naturally produced in the person's gonads are a pretty standard procedure and, as mentioned, practically mandatory for most transgender women due to how powerful testosterone is, Aydin has deliberately drawn a distinction between HRT and blockers, even though a vast majority of HRT cases would involve said blockers. Her statement is akin to saying, well, we have safety statistics on how safe the average motor car is, but no one is telling us what the safety of cars with seatbelts is. You know, it's a line that most common-thinking people wouldn't even think to cross, as every car made in the past 30 years has had seatbelts with very few exceptions. Benefit of the doubt, what might have tripped Aydin up is a misunderstanding of why in adolescence hormone blockers are expressly divided. See, this goes back to what hormones do to your body. Gosh, this video is turning into a hit piece on testosterone, isn't it? But testosterone is the more dramatic hormone, so it's just easier to illustrate. Testosterone changes the human body. It causes most secondary male sex characteristics in boys, such as facial hair. It deepens the voice, contributes to hair loss, along with a host of other nasty side effects like making the skin more greasy. It also shapes the skull, giving men Neanderthal head, if you wonder why men have such deep-set eyes compared to women. Hormones are why. Estrogen is similar, albeit less dramatic, helping to shape female hips for childbirthing and swelling the breasts. So thus, if a child of, say, 11 begins to question their gender identity, there's a vested interest in delaying puberty by a few years to give the child a chance to back off their new gender identity, or enough time to decide they want to proceed with full HRT. Advancing natal puberty for a transgender child, and I am speaking to the legitimate transgender children here if Aydin happens to be watching, can cause a great deal of distress. So delaying these skeletal and secondary sexual changes will enable the child to better pass as their social sex, which is incredibly important for the rest of their life in terms of getting a job, dating, or just general confidence. And medically speaking, as your own data shows, there is no visible adverse reaction to simply delaying puberty by a few years. The hormones are still being produced, and it won't kill anyone to get their breasts or have their balls drop when they're 13 instead of 11. If they decide to abandon the path, This is why juvenile studies mark these as different. The blockers are, by their nature, non-committal. But full HRT is very committal, hence why in juveniles the distinction is made to show that doctors aren't forcing anything on children. But now that the alt-right has that, they apparently have moved the goalpost one more to the side. And this is a major issue because it's likewise cornerstone to much of Aydin's video, where she didn't seem to do the barest amount of research to know that hormone blockers are a part of HRT, which inclines me to believe that her sources are primarily those whom she already agrees with, those sources that say she doesn't need to know about that because she's normal, which I know is odd for someone who chose their avatar to look like a gender-fluid wino. And a third major point, which I have to address here, which is kind of multi-layered, so sorry if this isn't as tight as the other two. Aydin Diviner's video is pretty insistent that transgender people suffer from a mental disorder and that transition is not a valid treatment for their condition. This is a bit packed, so let's unravel this Gordian knot from 1991. Now, first, Aydin is adopting a white man's burden argument when it comes to the trans community. If asked, Aydin would very likely answer that she's just concerned for their mental health. Her insistence that transition is a bad idea only stems from compassion. And it's a good dog whistle because it says the right things, but implicit is that the act of wanting to alter your gender expression makes you mentally unbalanced. Shameful. As supporting data, several times Aydin references data regarding the transgender community and their abnormally high mortality rate, as well as a few other bits of data like how transgender people are more likely to be at the bottom of the economic class. Alright, first... oh fuck. Let's look at this chart. This chart... holy fuck. This chart does not say what Aydin insists it does. Keep your attention on the bottom line here and see what Aydin has to say about it.
And the actual outcomes? They're not positive, guys. Looking back at the Haas data, we can see that across pretty much all categories and treatments, propensity to attempt suicide was identical or nearly identical in transgender people who wished to receive a certain treatment and those who had actually received it, across any number of options, including hormones, forwarding a decrease in suicide propensity by 5%, that's the highest, mastectomy patients by 1%, and hysterectomy by 1%. Both male to female and female to male bottom surgeries resulted in no change in suicide attempts, and receiving counseling even increased suicide attempts from 39 to 44%. The only consistent positive effect was in female to male phalloplasty, indicating reduced suicide proclivity from 56 to 46%.
See, Aydin has no idea how to interact with this chart. It's almost Sargon levels of laughable how she's unable to read the data in front of her. So let's begin with the first problem, the very top. Note what the first word is. This is the first word of the chart. Lifetime. This chart is not saying, as Aydin implies, that this is a measure of transgender people after receiving treatment. This chart is studying the lifetime risk of transgender people. This is a very common problem in the alt-right because they often look at transgender suicide data and immediately attribute it to the transition itself, rather than taking away the much more simple and indeed correct conclusion that the state of being transgender causes so much distress in our society that it puts these people at risk for the entirety of their lives. This is the first problem, and I know that because, again, this is a lifetime study. See, for all we know, all of these suicides happened before the respondents even considered themselves transgender. Or they could have all happened after, but this chart doesn't give us that data. It is only telling us what, at this snapshot in their life, their past history with suicide is. Further, and this is bonus information, Aydin says the only good result was female-to-male phalloplasty. But here's a trade secret. Phalloplasty is much less advanced than vaginoplasty. So thus, if a medical science is much less advanced, it is therefore much more expensive, as in 6 figures expensive. So why does that matter here? Because this group down here is the group that could afford it, compared to this group, whose primary barrier is probably financial. as many of these barriers are. I'm not actually faulting Aydin on not knowing that particular piece of information, but if you're comfortable enough to afford a phaleoplasty, there probably aren't as many compounding factors to put you at risk of suicide. You're more likely to live in a nice house with a supportive community and all those upper middle class delights. Again, I wouldn't expect anyone to find that in an offhand Google search unless they were explicitly looking for it, but I raise the point to demonstrate that there are many theoretical frameworks with which to interact with this data, which is something Aydin does not do. She reads off as many facts as she thinks sound negative to absolve herself from understanding what these figures might mean. But you don't have to take my word for it. Let's scroll up the page that Aydin cut off, probably because it shoots holes in the narrative she's pushing. The survey did not provide information about the timing of reported suicide attempts in relation to receiving transition-related healthcare, which precluded investigation of transition-related explanations for these patterns. In layman's terms, we didn't ask whether or not the suicide attempt was before or after transition. Thus, it is inappropriate to attempt to draw transition-related conclusions from our data. Let's use a study that Aydin actually uses almost properly. This Swedish study of transgender persons after sexual reassignment surgery.
2011 found, indicating in their longitudinal analysis data of the Swedish population that after undergoing surgery or hormone treatment for gender dysphoria, both male and female transgender people were significantly more likely than the general population to commit suicide. So we don't just have correlates here, we actually have a longitudinal effect. It means that having surgery and taking hormones does not generally decrease your propensity to commit suicide.
See, you can even see the little graph Aydin used in her video down in the corner here. So right off, a better job on this one, Aydin. You actually picked a study which analyzed what you claim it does. But, are its conclusions congruent with yours? Let's find out, shall we? So here's a helpful trick for the layman wanting to read academia. While all the details are important to understand the full context, you can easily filter out what a study and its researchers want you to understand by the objective, that is what they set out to find, and by the conclusion section, which is the understanding that these trained experts have concluded based on the data that has been gathered in their study. And what does this study say about the subject of sex reassignment surgery on transgender persons' well-being? Quote, persons with transsexualism after reassignment have considerably higher risks for mortality, suicidal behavior, and psychiatric morbidity than the general population. Our findings suggest that sex reassignment, though alleviating gender dysphoria, may not suffice as treatment for transsexualism and should inspire improved psychiatric and somatic care after sex reassignment for this patient group. See, the study here is making a very important distinction, and you might have missed it if you weren't paying attention. I don't blame you. So let's highlight two important keywords here. See, here, the study says sex reassignment alleviates gender dysphoria, which is why it is a standard treatment. But here, they don't write gender dysphoria again. They write transsexualism. This is actually very important because this is an academic paper. They aren't picking out words like Shakespeare to avoid repeating themselves and breaking out a thesaurus. No, they're making a distinction between feelings of gender dysphoria and living your life as a transsexual individual. See, the paper is saying you can't just give someone a genital facelift and kick them out the door. Being transgender is far more complex than that, and it requires support from the community, otherwise these people are still at risk for being perceived as deviant. And should inspire improved psychiatric and somatic care after sex reassignment for this patient group means we should be developing more resources, not restricting the ones that exist. If they felt, as Aydin does, that SRS did not help, they wouldn't have included that after sex reassignment bit. You know, they leave it in there to imply it remains the standard operating procedure, and these are all conclusions borne out by the data of the study. Another out-of-date reference is her belief that the traditional gender dysphoria is always present from childhood. And while it's true a number of transgender people are in that category, and a large number still can backward interpret flags for what they were with hindsight, this hasn't been the standard definition in nearly 20 years. A number of people don't transition until very late in life. This misunderstanding is demonstrated best here.
Back to the rider data. In addition to being more likely to experience gender dysphoria and identify as trans according to current statistical information, natal females with dysphoria were more likely to experience long-term mental health problems. 68% of natal females who felt very masculine reported poor, fair, or good health, compared to 49.2% of natal males who felt very feminine. And further, 34% of natal females who felt very masculine reported physical health problems or disabilities, compared to only 19.1% of natal males. So we have some indication here that natal females might be at a little bit of greater risk or suffer a little bit more from this. So, what then can we do to help these people?
Did you miss what she did wrong here? Okay, so Aydin is describing the healthcare of natal males who present very feminine and natal females who present very masculine. That probably doesn't seem out of the ordinary, right? Let's go back up to the beginning of this clip, however. Do you see it now? What are these little boxes up here, the more eagle-eyed among you are wondering? TGNC assigned male at birth? Is that a reference to the school district where they collected the surveys from? No, this is transgendered non-conforming. Aydin only read the bits about very feminine boys and very masculine girls, but every category in this graph is a transgender child. See, some trans women present very masculine even after transition, and some trans men still choose to present as feminine. The presentation of gender is not gender identity. But Aydin Swashbuckler here has a preconception that only those who express the most extreme contrary to their natal sex would be transgender, so thus, she blocked out all the information on this chart that was actually trying to convey to her. For comparison, here's another of the tables from the writer study, where you can clearly see TGNC and cisgender being the division, where obviously it is declaring that these two groups are distinct. So we know from the survey's internal methodology that everyone in Aydin's chart here is transgender or somehow non-conforming. And to top off this 30-year-old Sunday,
the caveat. I understand the criticism being, well, if we don't start these people very young, then they'll never look like the opposite gender. But I've seen some pretty good works at transitioning of people who were post-pubescent.
I believe I speak for all considerate people here. Fuck off. Transgender people don't transition to be sexually appealing to you. Your approval is not what's important. So find someone who cares. The last factor in someone's life-changing medical decision is going to be, what does someone from Baltimore, West Virginia think of my body? It's not only arrogant to assume that people care, but it's as bad as the guys who see you making out with your girlfriend and assume you're doing it purely to get their attention. And I don't care about this as a personal statement here, not really. Like, if Aydin was chatting with someone and she had said this, I wouldn't blink, and they probably wouldn't either. But in the context of her video, which is trying to be a thoughtful piece and failing, it is contributing to equate sexuality with gender identity and just being a huge logjam in the river of compassionate care. Okay, so these are 3 areas of Aydin Tinkerer's video that I fundamentally think demonstrate either her lack of care or malicious intent, but if I have to pick one, it's probably the former. She just doesn't know how to learn. Another fine product of the American educational system. But just in case you aren't quite convinced yet that her attempts to look smarter than Sargon are limp and flaccid, let's drum through a few more specific instances. One of my favorite bits has to be this part, where Aydin is condemning the fact that one of the studies she wants to debunk used phone interviews as a means of collecting data.
What is the problem with conducting phone interviews, particularly when it concerns a sensitive topic like transgender identity, and whether or not one is happy with having received a serious surgery such as a mastectomy? The fact of the matter is that any kind of face-to-face or phone interview has a greater potential to lead the participant towards the desired outcome or result of the interviewer. That's just kind of how leading questions work. Even if you are a very well-trained person, the more human elements you add in, the more error you add as well. Are you sure you really felt dissatisfied with your chest surgery? Really? Are you super sure? Can you confirm that for me? Look, I don't know what actually happened here, but I can just see how that would be a very easy thing to fall into when you specifically use phone surveys rather than online or paper ones with the exact same Likert type instrument. It's something called acquiescence bias. I'm not saying that is necessarily what happened here, but it's why interviews are really only used in social science context where those interviews might provide unique information.
So Aydin believes that interviews in person and phone surveys should be reserved when unique information can be required. But by Aydin's own admission, even in her alarmist fear-mongering, the highest prevalence of transgender individuals caps out at 0.6%. And as Aydin herself says, traditionally, trans men have been rarer than trans women, so an even smaller fraction of that 0.6. And this isn't even every trans man. They are explicitly looking for young adult trans men who had breast tissue at one point in their life. It even says in Aydin's screen cap here that people who didn't have breasts were disqualified, so we have to cut that down even further. And I don't think I'm being nitpicky. Aydin's own video is sharing this information. The analysts wanted the study to be as complete as possible, and when you're dealing with this tiny fraction of one sliver of the population, to literally acquire the data Aydin's whinging is demanding they find, you don't think that that's a very unique data set and insight to avoid this study being like 12 people and thus statistically irrelevant? All right. Let's try an example that requires a little bit of critical thinking and not 5th grade literacy.
To confirm her data, such as this study from DeVries et al. 2011, in which the abstract would seem to confirm that there are no comorbidity issues with other psychiatric disorders and gender identity disorder. Ultimately, when you go in and look at the data, you can find that yes, there are, with 32% of those who present with gender dysphoria having one or more DSM-4 diagnoses, compared to a 17% in the general adolescent population. Yeah. Even people who support Dr. Olson-Kennedy can't seem to really get around some of the facts that gender dysphoria is a psychiatric disorder.
Okay, this is a fun one. Aydin here is pretty clearly, I think it's shown, trying to show that transgender people have high comorbidity with mental health disorders, and by extension, therefore transgender people have a mental disorder and should be treated as such. But again, we have to ask if Aydin Beguiler watched her own video. You know, when Rage After Storm has the audacity to put information that contradicts her viewpoint on the screen, she's at least intelligent enough to blur it out. But that's a low bar that Aydin doesn't even appear capable of meeting, and I know she can do it. She had some sophisticated video editing in this piece. So let's read this together. When comparing this rate with results of studies that were conducted with the same instrument and in the same age group, adolescents, the 32% that met DSM-4 criteria for one or more co-occurring psychiatric disorders is, on average, more than the general population, but less than in youth receiving mental health care. For example, 21% of a Dutch adolescent study met criteria for one or more DSM-3 diagnoses. When using DSM-4, this was true for 17% of adolescents in a large North American metropolitan area, whereas in youth attending mental health services, a 60% estimate was found. So, what is this saying? On an uncritical analysis, it appears to say exactly what Miss Paladin says. Gender dysphoric individuals in this study had a higher comorbidity of psychiatric disorders than the general population has psychiatric disorders, by roughly 50% more than the Dutch study, and nearly double that of the North American one, and we should assume the normalization of the North American study that transgender youth have double the rate because they both use the DSM-4. However, what's important to the conclusion is the but here. See, if you take the sampling of adolescents receiving treatment in mental health services, that comparison sharply drops, and transgender youth 32% is nearly half of the 60% of the mental health services group. Because logically, If gender dysphoria was a mental illness like any other, those who suffer from it should, in theory, have a comorbidity concurrent with other people suffering from any other psychiatric disorder. But the gap between the existing rate of comorbidity and that expected rate, if you put it in the other direction, it would go all the way down to 0. The transgender population is far closer to the bell curve on the general population than they are to the mentally ill. They would be separated from the former group by roughly 11 to 15 percentage points, and separated from the latter by 28. For transgender youth to be so far away from the standard deviation would mean it is inappropriate to classify it as a psychiatric disorder like any other, and that is far more likely there are other outside pressures causing the inflated numbers of comorbidity, which is a concern. Aydin pretty desperately wants to think that gender dysphoria is a mental illness, so she sees any deviation from the norm as indicative of that, but that isn't good enough. You must provide an alternative narrative to the accepted science if you're going to say something so outlandish, and Aydin's alternative narrative is debunked again on her own screen because she doesn't know how to read properly. And it's a tangent, but this DeVry study counters her primary assertion that there are too many cases of rapid onset gender dysphoria, because this very study says, quote, "It is interesting that in the general population, the rates of anxiety and depression are generally higher in female than male adolescents, and the prevalence rate of disruptive disorders is lower in females comparative with males. Apparently, adolescents with GID show some types of psychopathology that are usually associated with the desired gender. So there really was this transgender plague, as Aydin asserts. That should be throwing off these numbers. But like most of the known data, this is consistent with neural structure in gender dysphoric individuals, matches that of their desired gender more than their natal gender." Okay, let's do a fun one.
When you start looking at the long-term health outcomes, they're not so fine. And I'm sorry, this is going to be a very long video, guys. As I mentioned before, there's a problem in all of these studies with participants potentially wanting to either acquiesce to researcher bias or as a function of something called social desirability bias, which is not wanting to paint the transgender community poorly because you're part of it. So you want everyone to look positive. You want transgenderism, gender dysphoria, to be recognized as a real mental health issue, and I agree, it is. So of course you don't want to say, well, no, I regretted my transition, because then you look like you're betraying your fellow trans people. Despite the fact that you may very well know people in your own life and in your own community who have regretted their transition. But that's precisely why we need to look away specifically from self-reports, because self-report can be highly subject to the kind of contamination I just mentioned, and into actual outcomes.
When it comes to issues like gender identity and sexuality, what else is there beyond self-reporting? Are these categories that can be independently verified somehow? And if they can be, why doesn't Aydin propose an alternative? Probably because she's uncreative and, as I think we've established, illiterate, which is generally a major problem for this anti-expert lifestyle. Like climate change. You can deny climate change all you want, but deniers don't actually propose climate models that accurately mirror real-world data. If they presented such models, they'd be taken much more seriously. The same applies here. Aydin has no proposal for determining if someone has gender dysphoria beyond self-reporting.
Another thing to really keep in mind here with that mastectomy research is that she used a very, very strong cutoff of 25 years old, with 64% of her post-surgical sampling having been 18 or younger when their top surgery was performed, with an average age of 19. And that's another place where Dr. Olson-Kennedy and her research conflicts with a wealth of extant data.
I shouldn't have to explain why it is kind of ridiculous for Aydin to be furious here when her video is predominantly about gender dysphoric youth, that a study focused exclusively on gender dysphoric youth. Is that enough? I feel like there should be more here, but it seems pretty self-evident. Alright, it's a pretty common fact of child psychology that children are very impressionable. So for the first time, I'm going to use something not in Aydin's video, but it much better illustrates the point, even though many of the interviews that Aydin links contains opinions that corroborate this. But let's just make a little detour. I promise we'll be right back. You've probably heard of the Kern County Panic at some point in your life. If you haven't, in brief, it was a series of child sexual abuse cases in the 1980s in Kern County, California. It started with a grandmother coaching her grandchildren that they had been abused by their parents, and the claim that it was part of a child sex ring. The chain of events then spiraled into something not too dissimilar from the Salem witch trials, and before long the FBI realized that with dozens of cases of prosecuted satanic child sex cults throughout the continent, does that sound familiar? They would need to step in. If there was such a huge underground child sex ring, surely they would have heard of it by now. Well, when the federal government came in and brought in their own criminal and child psychology experts, they were horrified to learn that Kern County law enforcement had conducted interviews with children without the presence of anyone trained in handling them. No one knew how to do youth psychology, and the recordings of the police interviews were riddled with leading questions, coached backtracking, and generally unprofessional behavior that you could maybe get away with in an adult, but certainly not with a prepubescent child. Reading from the Wikipedia page for the daycare abuse panic, quote, children are vulnerable to outside influences that lead the fabrication of testimony. Their testimony can be influenced in a variety of ways. Maggie Bruck, in her article published by the American Psychological Association, wrote that children incorporate aspects of the interviewer's questions into their answers in an attempt to tell the interviewer what the child believes is being sought. Studies also show that when adults ask children questions that do not make sense, such as, is milk bigger than water? Or is red heavier than yellow? Most children will offer an answer, believing that there is an answer to be given, rather than understanding the absurdity of the question. So let's bring this back to Aydin. Who is this gentleman? Aydin Totemist gives him a lot of attention. His name is Kenneth Zucker. He was a clinician at a gender identity clinic when he was fired in 2015 for promoting what was called effectively transgender conversion therapy. In short, the review found he was unduly pressuring young children to turn away from gender identity. We can see this in his own words, quoting this Guardian article about the documentary Aydin features. Quote, however, he had previously said that his goal was lowering the odds that such a kid gets older, he or she will move into adolescence feeling so uncomfortable about their gender identity that they think it would be better to live as the other gender and require treatment with hormones and sex reassignment surgery. So here he is, outright stating that his goal is to make as few children show outward signs of gender dysphoria as possible. Aydin quotes Kenny Zuckerberg here at length, how he believes strongly that most of these children are just gay, which again is very backwards in the type of thinking from the 1970s that trans was just the ultimate transformation of a gay person. But the presence of gay trans people and asexual trans people has caused the medical community to completely separate gender identity and sexuality. And this isn't new, this is 20 years old. The reason Zucker was fired was because he was found to be unduly impressioning children with answers he wanted to hear, rather than allowing those children to give him those answers on their own. If Zucker was correct, he wouldn't have needed to engage in leading behavior to bring about his desired outcome. And again, let's read his quote. Zucker isn't saying that the child would be cured of their gender dysphoria, but rather that the child would choose not to pursue gender transition. That doesn't imply that the feelings are gone, but could just as easily be read that they feel the correct socially accepted behavior is not to pursue that dream of theirs, which is easy to see happening when you have a psychologist telling you, oh, you're not trans, you're just gay. Further reading this Guardian article, Susie Green of the Mermaids Foundation, Green said that she was contacted by the producer of the documentary, but only to see if she knew anyone who had detransitioned, and said it was worrying that this had been the only focus for the program makers. Let's address this side-splitting point.
And moreover, as I mentioned, you're the ones conflating biological sex with gender expression. When you say a little boy playing with dolls means that he's transgender, who here is conflating those two concepts? It's not me. I'm saying maybe that little boy is a little gay.
Aydin, baby, I don't need to look up this data. No little boy has ever been diagnosed as transgender solely because they played with a Barbie doll. And here's my final complaint with all of this, because we're getting long, so I'll be brief.
as research dating back to the 80s, as seen here in a review from Zucker and Lawrence 2009, indicates that a greater number of male to females versus female to male transgender people has been the historical norm. Further, in the summation of large studies conducted between the 1990s through the early 2000s, as collected here in this graph from Marciano 2017, generally found a greater prevalence for male to female transgender people in the past, with an analysis of data collected as recently as 2012 in the Dutch population in Cooper and Wilson 2013, between participants ages 15 and 70, there were still reported to be more male to female identifying individuals at 1.1% versus female to male participants at 0.08%. But since then, it seems to have flipped, as additional data from the United States, the United Kingdom, Canada, Finland, and other studies from Denmark have all found a rapid reversal, with more and more assigned female at birth people now identifying as transgender. This is particularly of import when it comes to children, because they have always been more likely to express gender identity issues, as data going back to 1974 illustrates, with an explosion of cases of young people expressing these kinds of concerns, gender nonconformity, going up.
So what is Aydin saying? Well, she's telling us that in the past, transgenderism was mostly male to female, but now it is inclining more female to male, all right? But then she posts this graph. What is this graph? Let's look at it ourselves. Okay. At first glance, and that's the only glance Aydin is hoping you take, it seems to confirm her claims. Little blue bars on the left representing male to female, and little pink bars representing female to male, and the ratio seems to reverse over time. But there is literally nothing here that makes sense from a scientific perspective. Okay, first, these pools that this chart is drawn from are barely comparable. One is a study of Canadian transgender teens, others are studies of Dutch transgender teens, but these ones, labeled Tavistic, that's a single gender clinic in the UK, and you don't need to be a scientist to have a little red warning light pop in your head while comparing a single building to entire Commonwealth nations might not get the most scientific results. Second, though this isn't apparent, these are measuring percentages, not total numbers of children. So thus, if a clinic only treats about 30 patients a year and in one specific year, their gender ratio is lopsided, it's going to greatly influence how this looks on a chart. And while if I were running such a clinic, I might sit up and take a note of it, I wouldn't immediately go into a panic. You know, it's kind of like how the best way to predict elections is high school mock elections, because children vote like their parents. And for every rebellious teen casting a protest vote against her hippie, flower-loving parents, there's an equal proportion of rebellious teens on the other side casting a vote to spite their God-fearing mom and dad. But in a single clinic for a single year, that kind of balancing of the scales might not happen because the sample size is so tiny. Now, other than the Dutch studies, which were national, I can't actually find the data this chart comes from. The reference on this page that Aydin drew it from redirects to a blog, which is 404'd, and all other references to it on the internet inevitably loop back to this source, so I can't be sure if the Finland study is the country or a single clinic in Finland like the Tavistic. And perhaps most egregiously, these studies aren't balanced by year. So the first sets here start in 1999 and 1989, respectively, while the rest of the data points have an earliest cutoff date of 2010. So while they are evenly spaced here, there's actually about 30 years between the start of the Dutch data and most of these other data points. And then we have the most shameful part here. This one marked Finland is labeled 2015, but the Tavistic set behind it is marked as 2015 to 2016. So they didn't even organize this in chronological order. So there's two possibilities. Either one, the people who made this article don't know that 16 is a bigger number than 15, which I won't rule outright. But my personal theory is, too, that these people didn't care how the data was organized. They just wanted to make sure that the little pink bars constantly trended up and the little blue bars constantly trended down, and suckers like Aydin Crusader here fell for it. All right, now, before we leave, I want to do the decent thing and focus on points where I agree with Aydin. Just in case you think this is some kind of hit piece, it really isn't. I am trying to take her seriously. She's just failed to engage and present a coherent argument because she thinks she's far more clever than she really is. But what else can we expect from a doctor in media psychology? So the first point where I will agree with Aydin, there isn't nearly enough data focusing on the intersectionality of autism and gender dysphoria. Yes, that's right, Aydin. You're talking about intersectionality here, but because you've never read a definition of talking about intersectionality that wasn't on Breitbart, you don't actually know what the word means. See, one of the concerns with children who have autism is that they don't often have the typical ability to read or express social cues. And gender expression is an area which is very heavily composed of social cues. You can see where there might be problems of misdiagnosis if medical professionals aren't keeping that intersectionality in mind. And there really needs to be more data to better understand that relationship. So I agree with Aydin wholeheartedly on the principle here. I do disagree that we should put a screeching halt on treating any youth for gender dysphoria, but we've already covered how much Aydin knows about how treatment works. And as I mentioned way back at the beginning of the video, I agree with Aydin Dark Ranger that the concept of rapid onset gender dysphoria needs to be examined more. While I did mention the lopsided gender disparity in the study as a potential weakness, it is very useful to have on hand when one considers that this is an age group where eating disorders are known to spread socially among young girls. Wow, for someone who hates intersectionality so much, Aydin, sure you are bringing up a lot of those intersectional talking points. I wonder why that is. So, what conclusions can we draw? Why did I feel the need to make this? Well, I think the biggest is that just because you can physically read a study in literature, you need to do more than that if you want to do anything useful with the data. And you need to read all the data if you're going to argue contrary to that data. But I want to tell a story about where the heart of Aydin's video, as I see it, is. Aydin, like many on the right, sees a change in the way society has traditionally seen something. And to this mindset, if this was a natural part of human behavior, we would have seen it prevalent in our culture long before now. And while I could go into long descriptions of how we can literally track the progress of anti-cross-dressing laws from Ohio in the 1840s westwards towards Nevada in the 1880s, literally tracking the city ordinances district by district as the gender nonconforming community was continuously pushed westward, or go into how the Romans officially recognized transsexuality and would even allow romantic partners as such, even though they would never be able to be married because in Rome a marriage was not considered consummated until the birth of the first child, I actually don't want to focus on this multitude of historical examples. I would rather tell you a story. I come from a big Italian family. You know, I had a number of aunts and uncles, and then I had an extra dozen aunts and uncles who lived in my grandmother's kitchen, that sort of thing. So my siblings and I had innumerable relationships with adults as kids, and never seemed all that odd to us. And we knew an older family figure here to be a little unpredictable with how she would react to questions of sexuality and morality, but we read it off mostly as a quirk, and we noticed little things, like we could tell when she was going to meet a very specific friend of hers that based on how much makeup she wore or how nice her clothes were. Again, this wasn't weird to us. We didn't fixate on it. It was just something we absorbed in passing over the course of years. But this person was, on the surface, very religious, pretty knee-jerk and calling things sinful. This presented a slight problem when she first found out my sister had a girlfriend. We were not sure how that would go down. But later, this person pulled my sister aside and said she understood, and even told her a story about her own youth when she said she was attracted to a friend of hers and even thought about not getting married for her. This woman, for the record, was happily married, or I assume happily married, as long as we had known her. But it suddenly dawned on us, as we put these pieces and others together, that it was probably likely that she had been a bisexual all along, but because she didn't have the language, because her society told her, well, you like dick, right? So you're straight as an arrow. She had no way to express that bit of herself, and she hadn't recognized it for what it was, and was blind that it wasn't actually something everyone felt. You know, she thought everyone just felt that way about other women, and that's not true. And this woman who once said that using electronics at Christmas was a sin didn't bat an eye at homosexuality. See, having language is incredibly important. What I think we're seeing with this, quote, explosion in the trans population, I don't think that's peer pressure. I think this is people finding language to express themselves that in previous years was pretty harshly suppressed. Yes, naturally, as we have more words, as this becomes more public, a growing number of people are going to see the option staring them in the face and say, holy crap, that describes everything about me. And, you know, having those words are important, and we know because Aydin uses terminology so badly in this video, and this comes to my mind from a lack of empathy, and I don't mean that in the touchy-feely way, I mean the scientific form of empathy, the ability to see things from someone else's perspective, the ability to grow beyond the confines of your skin and consider for but a moment how things look from someone else's skin prison. You know, Yahtzee has a saying about the gaming community. Players don't know what they want until they've gotten it. And the same is true here, though obviously not in a one-to-one comparison. What I mean is, before they have the words, people have a hard time expressing a desire. But once you give them those words, once you open their mind to the possibility that they hadn't considered, there's a whole new community looking at what they want in a different way. Aydin doesn't demonstrate the ability to read data in any way other than what her own personal understanding of gender expression and her own life experiences provides. It helps in some places. She is candid about having been a tomboy and admitting she probably didn't get it as bad as boys of her age that wanted to wear skirts. But it limits her creative ability to stretch that mind into something useful. She seems incapable of drawing a conclusion that she doesn't already agree with or isn't spoon-fed her from a talking head. And she seems to have no independent thoughts on the matter that don't come out as a load of gibberish if you're familiar with the terminology she's using. Like, there was some software glitch, the text box is all jumbled. She's such an NPC. And that's why, if you're asking, well, why didn't you use this, this, and this, and bury her in a mountain of evidence? Well, I mean, that's one way to do it, but my hope would be that Aydin, if she ever found this video, and most importantly, Aydin's fans, would see that you don't need to just throw facts at a screen and bury your ideological opponents in them. You just have to know how to read. And it doesn't take a mountain of evidence to use your analytical primate brain and do your best to expand your understanding of the world. I really don't blame Aydin Paladin for not rummaging through every paper on the subject of gender dysphoria. Not many people have that kind of time, but I do think she could be more contemplative on the information she does have. And on the off chance that she and her audience aren't just dog whistling their compassion for the transgender community, I hope after this video they would pause and ask themselves, why are they parroting what they are parroting? And whether that apprehension is something they feel for the issues, or if that apprehension is tied to outcomes that someone else told them would come without showing their work. But based on this video, I still rank Aydin above Sargon in terms of illiteracy. You know, most of her links actually worked, but I still rank her, like, below Stefan Molyneux. So there you go, your alt-right YouTube scale of people who read words but never learned how to recompose those words into independent, rational thought. Wait, does this mean I have to do a Sargon video next?